Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
All right, good morning, Team Krulak community. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, just remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So I'm excited today to welcome Col Gerald Acosta to the special episode of the Brewcast. Col Acosta is currently the chief of the Directors Action Group, J3, of the Defense Logistics Agency. And today he's going to present some of the research he has done on the nexus between China's One Belt, One Road initiative and global shipping and transit, and especially through the Suez Canal. So, sir, good morning, and over to you.
Thank you, Ian. So thank you, Ian, for the opportunity to be here today. Definitely like to thank all the alumni and instructors at the Marine Corps University for the privilege of presenting my my research and my ideas. As you stated, I am Col Gerald Acosta. I am the Chief of Directors Action Group, at least for the next couple of weeks. My next assignment is I'll be a Brigade Commander for Defense Logistics Agency's Regional Command, CENTCOM, the U.S. Special Operations Command headquarters in MacDill, with a forward presence in the Middle East. It's a joint command, so really privileged to do that. With that, the reason why I'm excited to do this recording is because everything is intertwined. With my role at DLA and with how we're connecting with all the commanding commands and integrating into their op plan development, a series of thoughts that have come up is a strategy of reducing China's influence in every one of these particular regions against all the negative actors. And the research that I've done in the past, I think, brings a new light into this China's influence around the world and what we call the Belt Road Initiative. I'm going to go into my first slide, 2 slides, trying to keep this pretty short, and I'm hoping that at the end of this, it'll generate thought and discussions on how we can support our strategy development around the world against China's influence. So the first slide is the title is based on an article that I wrote. So obviously, if you want more expansion, you can go into the article. It's China's One Road, One Belt Grand Strategy, founded on the weaponization of the global supply chain. And even though it's the global supply chain, there's a lot of branches and sequels and themes and messages in the paper, as well as not only energy diplomacy, but resource management and the threat levels in trade and more of the economic influences around the world with respect to China as a competitor in this new domain. So a lot of things have been written on the weaponization of China's Belt Road Initiative. I think I'm going to bring a different perspective here, but before I do that, definitely want to get some general thoughts on the premise of my research and the premise of today's discussion. So the problem statement in the foundation is based on China's 2050 vision, which is the Belt Road Initiative in order to acquire the necessary resources to really mitigate a lot of the risk that they have in the country when it comes to food shortages and employment and manufacturing and a couple other natural resources to increase their GDP. Obviously, the Belt Road Initiative is more of a smart power means, although we've seen some trickling effects of military exercises and or forward deployments along the strategy and along some of the comprehensive partnerships that China has done with some international countries for forward presence, which can easily turn into military deterrence from their perspective. Obviously, the Belt Road Initiative is based on comprehensive strategic agreements. There are different levels of strategic agreements between China and different parts of the different regions of the world, different countries in the world. There's about 137 countries that are currently signed with China in some form of trade and or interchange of commerce or goods. Depending on the level of what that country can provide to China and its means of meeting its 2050 vision, Made in China 2025, and a couple of other national strategic documents that they've developed. Obviously, the more that the country can provide, the stronger that level of partnership and funding. With anything, dollar is the best language around the world, or money, currency is the best language around the world. So these strategic agreements are all based on financial investments that China are, as they develop their strategic partnership with these countries. It's all based on a financial package to really to mature that relationship, anywhere from infrastructure development and or trade and or construction or whatever it may be. When you look at the strategy, it's really based on economic corridors, and this goes back to the One Silk Road that historically was the trade of goods, and then fast forward to today, it's the economic corridors going through China into Europe or into Africa, and some would even argue into Central and South America for minerals and or natural resources. So Belt Road Initiative, as we stated before, 137 countries, looking at what we call the 1-2-3 economic strategy. It's either one, energy cooperation, exchange of culture and or media, and then human capital and technology exchange. So that infrastructure development, it's how China is really migrating into their influence into the region. How China goes into selecting these countries, this is where the weaponization comes in a little bit, the negative side of these partnerships. Obviously, they're all dependent on high debt GDP for each country. So if a particular country has a piece of terrain or a piece of infrastructure that is key to facilitating the global commerce for China, obviously that country now has catapulted all the way to the top to receive more funding. And you will see that in the Panama Canal and the investments that China has done there. Obviously, the recent investments that China is doing into Trinidad and Tobago in order to, as a quick line of distribution and supply into South America. So the more that the country has to offer to meet China's ends, the more China is willing to invest. And when you look at the high debt, some of these countries obviously don't have the GDP or the economic means for infrastructure development and or economic gains. Very rarely do they really qualify for some type of IMF loan. And so naturally, it just fits best when a country comes in with an infusion of cash or equity to do development, but it comes at a cost for the country, because in China's, again, weaponization, instead of interest-bearing payments, what they do is they put as a collateral that key piece of terrain that China deems necessary, whether it be a canal or a port or an airport or some type of rail infrastructure, everything always interconnecting into those economic corridors that China possesses. Now, how does that apply for us in the military and national security practitioners? More likely, probably you listening to this podcast. Well, for us, obviously, it's a focus on those global choke points, which facilitates not only our distribution means, but also the ability to power project military forces. And what we mean by those choke points, obviously, to give an example, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of the Indian Ocean. But for particulars of this study, we're going to do a deep dive in the Suez Canal, which for my research is the premise of what we're about to discuss, which is this strategy that China uses when it has identified a country that it wants to invest in, and then the necessary steps that it goes through in order to capture that key piece of terrain. And you can see this throughout. So said that, I'd like to go into slide 2 and really deep dive really deep dive into the actual framework itself. And this is where some of my research comes in, and hopefully this can help you as a national security practitioner as you're doing your strategy development. So what's key beyond what we know about an open source about the China Belt Road Initiative? I mean, we already know the grand scheme of things. We know the funding. We know the type of partnerships that they develop. We know the countries that China is interjecting into. We already know how well they're trying to develop in Africa and a couple of other continents. But what I've seen in my research, and this is based on my tours of duty in Egypt, and I saw it first in Egypt during the revolution when U.S. started to withdraw, and you could see a lot of the Chinese influence going into Egypt. But what I was able to also see in other parts of the world as I kept on doing this study is China's deliberate approach of creating this Belt Road Initiative in these key terrains. And what we've seen is the predominant domain is how China really influences what I call the economic zones. And what I mean by the economic zones is wherever China has gone to invest in a particular country. We'll take the Suez Canal, for example. Key premier, as you can well see in everything that happened in the news, key premier transport distribution system for global trade. When China went into the Suez Canal, and you can arguably state that it has great influence over the canal based on all the investments it's done, is they created an economic zone. And with that came a lot of rights and abilities to influence the mercantile system and the commercial system, which then leads into energy, diplomacy, and even military, foreign military sales, which affects us in the military planning. So let's take this by steps. The first step is, and we'll use again the Suez Canal as an example. The first step is China definitely determined that for its economic corridors in Europe and so forth, the Suez Canal was going to be extremely important. Obviously, about 60-70% of global trade goes through the Suez Canal on any given day, especially when it comes to oil and natural resources and food. So first thing they did was, when I say they, the government of China, the China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Obviously, they partnered with Egypt, and it provided based on Egypt's high GDP to debt ratio, they infused a bunch of cash into the Suez Canal for the construction, which Egypt readily accepted and used in order to expand the Suez Canal into its second lane. Obviously, if you're Egypt, there are a lot of benefits to your premise, to your country. That's extra transport that's going through the country. Obviously, with the fees and so forth, it's a higher inject of cash into the local economy, and not only that, but the national GDP at large. So exports and imports increased, almost twofold by the expansion of the Suez Canal. So all great news when it comes to global commerce and trade. But the Suez Canal then became, a prisoner of the high debt and that collaborative agreement because it became a collateral for China. Well, with the partnership and the infusion of cash from the Infrastructure Development Bank, then we go into step 2 of developing this economic zone. And step 2, then it's China's specific investment in that infrastructure zone, in that economic zone, in this particular case, the Suez Canal. So a lot of fusion of Chinese companies and expertise to do the actual engineering, design, and development, and then the actual export of Chinese human capital to go into the Suez Canal to do that engineering and that expansion. Then after they do the engineering and the expansion and the infrastructure is set in place, then it's where it gets a little bit complicated. You can see this throughout the world in these development of economic zones. Then the next step that they do, when I say they do China, the next step that China then does is that incorporates imports and export banks facilities inside the economic zones. So they've taken the Suez Canal. Imagine putting a circular a circle around it. Call that an economic zone. Inside that circle, now you've infused a Chinese bank, and the Chinese Import and Export Bank. That then bank allows to do financing and improve trade relations inside the bank. Now the threat here is that inside that economic zone, you're really protected against all measures that IMF or the World Bank may infuse on trade. So there's a little bit of independent movement, independent actions that China can take with Egypt inside that import-export bank inside that economic zone. So now, as we develop it, you see that China has infused human capital and construction dollars into the Suez Canal. They've created an economic zone. In the economic zone, they've put a bank. Now they can do trade and financial transactions. And then comes the third piece, which is once the economic zone is settled, then China starts negotiating with its countries, in this particular case with the government of Egypt, and now they're doing undersea IT cable construction. They get the rights for undersea construction within the perimeters of sea, and they start building IT infrastructure. So now that's the third phase of it. So now you can see how this economic zone is starting to mature. Once the IT and this undersea IT connections are undergoing, they're connecting the cables into the economic zone. They're connecting the cables into the Asian Development Bank and/or Import-Export Bank inside the tank, and they're connecting the IT infrastructure into the Suez Canal Transmission Authority. So now the canal has a bank, has IT infrastructure for signaling and finance, and they have key infrastructure, e-infrastructure inside the Suez Canal. Then comes the fourth part, which is then to create a cultural zone. So they do imagine a more larger circumference circle around the economic zone. Then that circumference then becomes a cultural zone, where now there's exchanges of students and culture and manufacturing and retail production. That retail production is probably a dangerous part because it's that zone that starts interconnecting the Chinese economic goods into that country's commercial system. So at the end of this, you have a zone that has, as you build up the steps, and you can see where it gets a little bit dangerous. Now you have a zone where it has a key piece of global terrain infrastructure, which is Suez Canal, that has injected Chinese infrastructure, e-infrastructure for the management of the canal. Inside the economic zone, within feet of it, you have a export, import, and an Asian Development Bank for the financial structure. You have the e-cables, the e-IT structure that is coming from China, connecting into the economic zone, which then connects to the outer perimeter, which that outer perimeter then becomes a manufacturing center, cultural zones, and the exchange of cultural goods into the retail market. And what has happened, and this is going to be the premise of my second paper, is China has created what we call the perfect inventory system. All of this IT structure from point of retail and sell at any given point inside a country's commercial sphere, all of that data goes into the economic zone. Within the economic zone, they can then produce a perfect inventory for the supply chain because they can do micro manufacturing for the sales of goods in that area. And if they cannot, through the IT structure, there is a signal that goes directly into the Chinese production, manufacturing, industrial zones for immediate production of that item. And so what has happened is that they've really revolutionized the theory of inventory. Low inventory, which means low cost. And when you look at at the trade aspect, because they have control of, or at least infrastructure control of key pieces of terrain like the Suez Canal, that then distribution of that good, if it has to go to China, has a perfect immediate route into the Egyptian commerce. Now multiply this by almost every single zone that China is doing worldwide, whether it be the Panama Canal zone or the Trinidad economic zone, or what you see in Pakistan in the economic zone, what you see in Djibouti in the economic zone in Djibouti. So these perfect infrastructure of inventory will then hurt U.S. trade and U.S. commerce in the long run, because now the competition is a little different. They would have competitive advantage in manufacturing, production, inventory, and distribution of goods. Not only that, but when you go in deep dive, which is the premise of my first paper, when you deep dive what we call port economics, which is the ports that Egypt has, or excuse me, that China has invested in worldwide, there is already evidence that there's a disruption of U.S. port processing of goods versus Chinese processing of goods. In my recent research, we saw a disruption of almost 1.5 days for a 20-foot container, where a Chinese container was processing at a 1.5 day rapid rate compared to a U.S. 20-foot container. That 1.5, if you were to use different calculus systems and monetary calculus, comes out to almost $100,000 loss. Now multiply that by the thousands of containers that are going in and out of these economic zones. It is definitely something that has to be studied. And when you look at my paper and you'll read my future paper, what you'll see is different recommendations that we use to counter this Chinese manufacturing, supply, and commercial tactic that will undermine U.S. trade. And what we think is obviously, when you look at the NDS and NSS for us national practitioners, is the overall good of the U.S. commerce and U.S. prosperity. So said that, Ian, I think that's the basis of my research. I think I've spoken too long, but hopefully I was able to generate some thought for future leaders out there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. I think in terms of time, that was perfect. And then if you have some questions and notes, I was down as we were going through. If you got some time to entertain those, and I kind of wanted to start like big picture and drill down into a couple of stuff. So, I've seen various versions of that global graphic of the network and the reach, One Belt, One Road, and all the different avenues, maritime, surface, the different countries into it. Has there been pushback or more success, or more specifically, any successful pushback in some of these countries who they feel an influence, or they bought off on it to realize what they want out of it? Has anyone been able to detach themselves from the One Belt, One Road once they're in it?
Yes, we've seen evidence, especially in Central South America. There's already, you can look at the news in the Panama Canal. China is their equities is starting to backfire a little bit, in a sense of they'll do a bunch of promissory notes and initial investments of funding, but then later on, because China might not have the solvency with the import or Asian Development Bank, there's stoppage of construction forward. You see evidence of that in Chile with minerals, Peru with minerals, and even Panama with the potential expansion of the Panama Canal. So you've already seen countries that legislatively are starting to try to regress and decouple from China's investment. And obviously, you can see trickles of legislatively in global news and in other regions of the world.
All right, sure. And then let's set kind of the same angle but different location. So, this is a massive expansion of influence coming out of China. Have there been any internal pressures or problems within the Chinese economy, political or social structure, as with this massive outflowing of goods, investments, and influence leaving the country? Has there been any blowback within the country in terms of either overextension or not providing enough influence and support internally for internal projects compared to this?
Yeah, no, it's funny because I think, so China just, was it 72 hours ago, they just published their GDP annual report. And so there was a before this, but prior to COVID, there was a constriction in the number of Chinese dollars or yuan that were invested in GDP, almost $1 trillion. There were announcements that they were going to reduce that by almost $200 billion. Later on, through open source, then they depicted that they were going to focus only on energy-related items. For that matter, clean energy and or renewable energy development projects, but only focus on key strategic points around the world for further construction and development. We'll see how it goes, because in this recent GDP report, annual physical report, their GDP actually expanded by 6%, with almost was a 5.1 unemployment rate. Now, what those numbers, how they hold true, who knows? Because they're not open with all of their with all their financial statements. But if there is a GDP expansion, then you would think naturally that they would also probably expand into certain economic zones that they seem deemed necessary for the global trade. Probably Suez Canal, Panama Canal, Strait of Hormuz, and into the mineral section of South America. So more to be seen on exactly how they start channeling some of their funding. But I know there was a constriction because of solvency in the bank, Asian Development Bank. But I think this new GDP report might lend to expanding more of the financial investment worldwide. More to follow on that one as we keep that Chinese economic pulse.
Yeah. All right, guys. So I want to do a little shift and focus on itself. The expansion and the influence they've gained over some of the strategic supply point, maritime trade, a lot of trade through. And then, just recently, we all got a very sudden lesson in vulnerability points whenever stuff, Suez Canal, global trade, grinding to a halt, significantly rerouted on something that was accidental. And so I'm wondering, with China's influence and reach into some of its own key maritime choke points that a lot of the trade passes through, have we done the work as a sort of U.S. national security students, professionals, to understand the impacts and what we would need to do in the case of, say, a deliberate blockage, one that that was designed to be much more difficult to clear, especially talking about the micro economic zone built around the Suez Canal. What if that wasn't an accident? What if that turned into multiple ships and China wouldn't let anybody clear it? Have we thought through what we would do and how we would potentially something done?
No, that's a great question. So for everybody that's out there, so let's take the Suez Canal. Obviously, a key point connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. So a naval fleet, we've earned as a U.S. throughout from the national FMS, foreign military sales, and also I forgot what year, I think it was the 67 U.S. peace agreement. We've provided $1.2 billion, and we give Israel 2.1 or 3.1 billion. We give Egypt $1.2 billion annually. and we've been doing that for over 2 decades. And what those dollars have always given us is automatic first response use of the Suez Canal and airspace around the Suez Canal for any type of kinetic activity into the Middle East. Obviously, a lot of historical accounts of being able to transport the naval fleet from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea in order to do kinetic activities. But what happens now once that China controls not only the operations of the port, but also the cyber threat that's in the port in the Suez Canal now. But more importantly is this, where we used to leverage U.S. foreign military cells to protect the Suez Canal with our own radar systems and our own defense systems. Now now what you see is a commingling of U.S. and Chinese military equipment inside the Suez Canal, and that's dangerous. Luckily, there hasn't been a time where we have to, but if this superpower competition were ever to move into more of a deliberate approach, you can see that already with the South China Seas, maneuvering of sea exercises. But what were to happen if those sea exercises would have moved into Horn of Africa? How would the impediment of having that immediate access into the Suez Canal, how would that detract U.S. strategy? How would that remains to be seen, but it's not as clear cut as it was before China started investing into these countries. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Kind of, I suspected the case was we still have some work to do to sort of figure out what how that commingling, as you put it, looks like, because it's definitely a new dynamic that's going to have to be dealt with in a way that doesn't exacerbate.
No, I mean, so before, prior to 20, I would say, when you look back 4 or 5 years, if you were U.S. aircraft, U.S. Navy, going through the Suez Canal via the sea or airspace, you felt comfortable because you had an Avengers system, you had a chaparral system that was protecting. You had radars, Navy Sea radars that were protecting and integrated into our systems. But now, you have Chinese radars. Now you have Chinese, air defense systems right next to each other. So, now if you are that pilot, that Marine or whatever it be, you're probably not as comfortable as you were before in your protective measures going through the canal, which is key. Because a lot of people don't realize, but if you don't go through the canal and you got to go around Africa, that could be an easy 2.5 days of maritime travel. In an environment where a minute is a lot, 2.5 days, that's an eternity in combat.
Yeah, and that that's kind of why I was asking the question, because I'm sure all of the global shippers got a rude and sudden lesson in just what an extra couple of days of transit can do when their ships had to go around. To my knowledge, it didn't really sort of impact any direct military operations, but yeah, you're right. 2.5 days is an eternity, especially in that region where the geography is so constrained. It does take a long time to travel, from one P2P train to the other in that very small geographic area. And 2.5 days could be, more than enough to get what you need.
Absolutely.
Okay. Kind of one last question, sir, and then I'll let you have any parting thoughts, and then we can wrap it up. So I was very interested in the perfect infrastructure of inventory you were describing in those micro zones that were growing up around the places where China had done its initial investment. And I was wondering how, if at all, it's possible to counter-influence these or even get them removed, because it would seem that they have a significant advantage in the amount of accurate and real-time data you can get just by the fact that you're there, and if you're doing that low inventory, the low cost, and you you have that data readily at your fingertips, whereas we don't have that immediately available. So it's probably more conjecture and estimate on our part. How do you counter that structure in those zones to make it less impactful?
So, I'll set the stage with the problem set. So you see the map right there on the slide. When you saw the map, you see all those economic corridors. So you see like these veins and arteries going into China. Those are economic corridors. But imagine all those lines, those veins and arteries are now an E architecture from any part of the world that's connecting via microsecond signals into the industrial base in China, where you take something off the shelf in Carrefour, which is is like our Walmart in some of these countries in that part of the world. You take something off the shelf, and you pay for it, and it's like Walmart theories, exponentially grown, where you swipe the cell, and then automatically, because of the forward positioning of manufacturing for China, either they can use the microzones to rebuild, and or if not, if they don't have the inventory there, it's an automatic signal back to industrial base in China to produce that part, put it in a ship, in a container, and ship it right back to that one store that that just sold that one Chinese good. Now compare that where it's one system, one central system of ordering, processing, and distribution. And you have the bank structure to be able to do the financing and the movement of that. And because you do have the collection and aggregate data of those ports, which obviously is the processing of the goods into each one of these countries, you can aggregate all that data to do the perfect inventory and the perfect shipment. I mean, that's the reason why the Walmarts and the Amazons are so good, right? Because they take this aggregate data and they're able to deliver goods in an immediate sense. Now compare that to the U.S. and U.S. manufacturing, where everything is so compartmentalized. You have one company that does manufacturing, you have one company that does distribution, you have one company that does construction, and then you have different companies that do subcomponents of parts. So for any producer or manufacturer here in the U.S., you have to compile all the parts, put it together. You probably have to outsource your ground transportation to get to a port, and you probably have to outsource your shipping company to move it somewhere else, and then you probably have to rely on other countries to do your trade. And all the manufacturing is done here because we don't do, other than partnerships that Fortune 500 companies might do with international companies forward for manufacturing. We ourselves, countries here, don't really control manufacturing forward. China does. So how can you do that? There's only one way. You have to invest in manufacturing forward. Now that comes at a cost of GDP and production here in the U.S. and or from a U.S. commercial aspect, like the U.S. commerce, they have to start injecting themselves into the studies of these economic zones and working with international monetary partners in order to get the regulatory requirements for the production and the trade inside those zones. Because right now, those economic zones don't fall under any type of regulatory requirements at either IMF or the World Bank or a couple of other entities that exist right now. So it's a free-for-all. So they have the ability to capitalize on fees. They have the ability to capitalize on production at a very competitive rate. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it certainly paints the picture, sir, and that's a steep hill to climb, especially if somebody else is already well ahead of you on that. Okay, so that's really what I have in terms of the questions. I'll let you have any final remarks or thoughts you want to share before we close it out.
No, I say thank you, for the audience that's listening to this. It's the reason why we do these speeches and these research is to obviously generate thought, expand how you analyze your thoughts and analyze your your assumptions and your constraints and your information when you're doing your research to do your command commands, op plans. These are definitely themes and messages you need to start injecting, and at the command level with our forward presence, things that we definitely have to think about and strategize about, because it's not just military movement. It's becoming an all-domain war, which is commerce and economics and diplomacy and energy diplomacy. And us as national security practitioners, we got to expand our minds and our responsibility in that domain. It's contested. All environments is contested nowadays. But us as practitioners need to study these areas to see how we can inject our military power into some more of these more smart soft power techniques. And hopefully this will elaborate some debate and argument as we go forward. So thank you for the opportunity for this.
Yeah, no, thank you, sir. And this is just the kind of sort of expanding of perspective that we've been trying to capture in this series that Dr. Wilhelm and initially the late Art Corbett started off to trying to just open that aperture for understanding all the different factors and layers that all play into this, because it's not just a military problem. It's going to take a lot of different players to operate effectively in this competitive and contested environment. So to Colonel Gerald Acosta, sir, again, thank you for your time, taking out time today. To our community of interest, we hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Brewcast, and make sure you're following us on social media for announcements on the dates and times for upcoming episodes, and we hope you can join us for the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Appreciate it.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.